Good evening. I want to welcome you to a special meeting of the Town of Los Gatos Town Council for February 11th, 2013, continued from our meeting a week ago of February 4th, 2013. Roll call, please, Madam Clerk.
Good evening, Mayor and Council members. Councilmember Joe Przinski.
Here.
Councilmember Marcia Jensen.
Here.
Councilmember Diane McNutt.
Here.
Vice Mayor Steve Leonardis.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Barbara Spector.
Here. If you'll all stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Given that this is a meeting continued from our meeting of last week, let me go over with you the process that we will be following. We will begin by hearing from those speakers who submitted cards last week, but who I wasn't able to call upon by midnight when we adjourned our meeting. After we hear from those people, we will then move the focus to the council, who will begin by asking questions, if any, of staff. And following those questions of staff, we will have discussion and motion by the council members. All right, now, our first speaker, Matt Strickland. Matt Strickland. Next speaker, Ivan Shadwick. Ivan Shadwick. Next one, Ellie Stern. Ellie Stern. Now, I do realize that there are folks in the lobby and folks in the library. So if one of these people comes forward later, just let me know. Next one, Michael Schusterman. Michael Schusterman. Not coming forward. Next, Lawrence J. Cosden. Lawrence J. Cosden. C-O-S-D-E-N. Next, Sue Farwell. Sue Farwell. And Ms. Farwell will be followed by Michael Oria.
Wow. Good evening, Sue Farwell. I am a resident of Los Gatos, and I'm here to talk about the land use issue for Templar Sports. I have worked with the town staff, the Planning Commission, and the Town Council for the past 21 years on many varied land uses in both the Central Business District and residential zoning and planning policies. I've agreed and disagreed with the town's current and past policy on retail and commercial land use and on many of the town's decisions concerning these policies. Never have I felt that our staff, our Planning Commission, or our Town Council has acted with disingenuous intentions. Many residents of Los Gatos have never been to the Planning and Building Department. I assure you that the process the town follows is very clear on procedure for a certificate of use and occupancy and a business license. There is no gray, just black and white. The intended use is either permitted under the current guidelines of the town's general plan and requires no further review, or the use falls under the category that requires a CUP and must go before the Planning Commission and/or the Town Council for public hearings. It is not up to the staff or the members of the Town Council to arbitrarily demand a public hearing for a permitted use, even if this is polarizing and controversial. I take offense that there has been accusations against the planning staff and the chief of police by members of our community. I encourage anyone that feels that the procedure was not followed to stop by the planning department and talk to the staff. Request information on the permit process that they are accusing of being subverted. The general public must accept that the decisions made by the staff are mandated by the current code as part of the general plan. Many opponents have alleged that the changes made on the business license by Templar Sports are not transparent. This is not relevant. Templar Sports could apply for a business license today, and there would be no reason to deny that license. It is not fair to try and restrict Templar Sports by limiting their business from firearms repair or their right to promote their business. Templar Sports must stand by the image they are representing here in the council chambers. They must continue with a commitment to the community for gun safety classes, safe operations for gun storage, gun safes, trigger and cable locks, along with retail sales and repairs of permitted guns. The opponents of Templar Sports have now opened the forum for discussion on future uses concerning the sale of guns in Los Gatos. This is the public process that is fair and correct. I hope that the town council has the courage to make a smart and informed decision that represents the best long-term interest of our town. Thank you.
Thank you. And for others who might be speaking, when you see you have 3 minutes. When you see the yellow light, that means you have 30 seconds left. All right, next we have Michael Oria. Michael Oria. All right, no one's coming forward. Richard Martinez. Richard Martinez. No one's coming forward. Robert White.
Madam Mayor, may I speak on Robert White's behalf? He's not here tonight. I was here last time. He gave me permission. I don't know if it's appropriate or not, but I'll yield to you.
Thank you, sir. We'll wait. Just use the one who have cards, but thank you. Is this one? All right. Would you please come forward if I called your name and give us your name, please?
My name is Richard Martinez, and I live in Santa Cruz. I've known Robert and his crew for a little while now, and I think they're running a good shop, and I don't think they intend to hurt anybody in Los Gatos, and I'm just supporting them. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martinez. All right, Robert White. Thank you. Seeing no one, and just hearing that he's not here, in fact, Edmundo, looks like ALIPE. And he will be followed by Kevin Smith.
My high school coach couldn't get it, and he was Hispanic, so I'm not going to push it. This has been an interesting event. This has been an interesting event, an important event. I mean, this is all about the rights of people and the rights of opinions and the rights of a city. But I think there's a bigger picture here. We're putting a lot of emphasis on the store and how it's going to affect in a negative way, but leaving out the positive that it has. And some of it has been said. The lady before said it perfectly. The issue of people is probably more important than the issue of the selling of the guns, because we have hearts that are just lost out there and just can't deal with life, whether it's drugs, alcohol, loss of everything. We have children we need to bring up. A lot of people have said children's safety. Is that what it's all about? Partially, yes. We've gone through the process of the permits, not informing, all the other stuff due to the fact that we just don't want the gun shop here. But the gun shop can be a positive aspect of the community used in a positive way. No one wants to see violence. No one cares to see violence. I mean, it's an ugly thing. But we also have the ability to also use that in a positive way. And I believe the gun shop can do that. Teaching respect to our kids is probably more important than walking by a gun shop and saying, that's evil. Because when you teach them respect, they'll walk by it and say, I need to take care of that in a positive way and respect it in a positive way in every aspect of our lives. Mental illness is not really the problem, it's how we got there. I mean, we've heard all this about mental illness, and it's a big problem. But how did we get there? Broken families, broken homes. You got dozens of excuses. But that still doesn't put the gun shop as the evil one in the equation. How do you fix that? That's a tough one. And it's much more work than just permitting the gun shop. And I believe that the gun shop can be a positive influence in the right way, and I think they're going about it the right way. The city council also needs to look at that in the right way. I mean, a gun is only wielded by the person that is using it, such as a knife, such as anything else. I grew up in LA. I've never served in the military, but in my junior high school, we had 6 shootings and 5 stabbings. Graduated in 77. High school, 5 stabbings, 6 shootings, 77. Didn't miss a day of class, was never tardy for class, and you know what? It's been going on ever since, and it's all broken families. When you fix that, the issue of the gun violence, the issue of the ugliness, it'll go away. But you can't just captivate it on the thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Alipe? Did I get it right then? Alipe? Is it Mr. Alipe?
Oh, Alide, A-L-I-R-E.
Oh, it's a D-E. Okay.
Yes.
Get your handwriting, too.
Thank you.
All right, Kevin Smith. Noting that no one is coming forward. Excuse me. C. Jeffrey Stanley. Mr. Stanley is coming forward, and he will be followed by Steve Quan, Q-U-O-N.
Good evening, Town Council and Madam Mayor. My name is Jeffrey Stanley. I'm a husband, father of 3 daughters, hunter, marksman, and a businessman. The company that I own has a lot of similarities with Templar Sports. We both help in the service of a constitutional right. See, I own Bad Boys bail bonds, and under the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and the 5th Amendment of the California Constitution, we are all guaranteed the right of bail. Some time ago, the city of San Jose set a moratorium on bail bond companies in the downtown area. The reason people were opposed to bail bond agencies were because of their lack of knowledge of our industry. Bail is dictated by the state and governed by the Department of Insurance. Without bail companies, jails become overcrowded, convicts are released early, and inmates are released on their own recognizance without any accountability. You may be unaware that crime rate around bail agencies is one of the lowest in San Jose, and property values held better than the rest of the city. You see, we do provide a very important constitutional right, and without these, we are less safe. Templar Sports offers more than service and products to our community. It allows access to a right. Taking away rights or restricting any of our rights will adversely affect us as a free society. Thank you, Council. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Steve Quan. Mr. Quan. Seeing no one coming forward. Deborah Chin. Ms. Chin, Deborah Chin. Not coming forward. Patricia Enstrom. And Ms. Enstrom will be followed by Sharon Cunningham.
Good evening, Patricia Ernstrom, lifelong resident of Los Gatos. The issue before us tonight is emotional and divisive, but we look to your leadership to act as a steward of the town and its residents. This isn't about the Second Amendment. This isn't about the right to bear arms. No one is saying that the people of Los Gatos do not have the right to gun ownership if they so choose. The issue is whether or not this is the right type of business that belongs in Los Gatos. Unfortunately, the lack of process has shown a complete disregard for the citizens, both for and against. I've watched these council and planning commissions proceedings for decades. I've heard why a restaurant in town was banned from having any kind of dancing at their location. I've heard people plea to have outdoor seating at restaurants, or current business owners being threatened to be shut down because they had one too many hairstylists at their salon. How many hearings were there before it was determined that no dog could be walked without a leash? Los Gatos has regulated everything, and now this. People at the hearing last week talked about Coast to Coast and other retailers that sold guns. I remember the good old days too, but that was a long, long time ago. Times are different now, and these unique times call for real leadership. If someone is filling out a business license application looking for a license to sell sporting goods when in fact they are not, that should be grounds for review. Sporting goods, but no bats, no balls, no skis, no socks, no helmets, no rackets, no clubs, and no shoes. Sporting goods, but not a single item to buy for any sports program offered at any school or recreational activity the town offers. While it says Templar Sports on the window, in documents filed with the town, they are listed DBA doing business as Templar Armaments. Pretty clear the purpose is not to serve the sporting good needs of Los Gatos and surrounding communities. Even the lawyer representing the owners called it a gun shop when he spoke right here last week. I don't have grounds to doubt that the owners will be honest following state and federal regulations and rules in the sale of guns. This is not about access to guns. There are plenty of places to purchase a weapon. The question is, why do we need to be one of those places? What do we as a community want to stand for? What kind of a community do we want to be? What we are talking about tonight deals with the bigger issue of the town taking a stand to say there are enough gun shops and enough opportunities to buy guns. I've listened carefully to people who have said that we'd be safer if more people had more guns. However, the daily barrage of anecdotal evidence does not seem to support that theory. The guns used at Sandy Hook were owned seemingly by a responsible gun owner. Columbine had an armed guard. Virginia Tech had a police department. Fort Hood was a military base. Unfortunately, one less gun shop won't prevent terrible things from happening, but we can be an example, and we can be one less.
Thank you. Sharon Cunningham, who will be followed by Kathy Sechrist.
Hello, my name is Sharon Cunningham, and I'm a resident of Los Gatos. So many questions and irregularities have been raised in the past few weeks since the public became aware that Templar Sports opened. The fact of public hearing, due process, permit irregularities, knowledge by the town staff that this would cause dissent, conflict of interest, lack of oversight, liability insurance, all this, and a store selling semi-automatic weapons and bullet buttons with plans to expand. Despite the assertions last week and in the minutes this week and addendum, there was something the town staff could do prior to issuing permits. Case law, see Amendment 14, is extensive, supporting the restriction of retail gun sales. Now today, the town council can adopt an emergency ordinance that would require all retail sales and home sales of guns to be frozen in the town of Los Gatos until ordinance and regulations are made by the town. Please do so immediately. You have the support of the town, and we are providing you with over 1,000 signatures collected in this regard. An immediate independent investigation is also requested, and an unpaid leave of absence for all town staff involved until the matter is resolved. We are also asking for an immediate deliberation in this matter so that this redundant dialogue is brought to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kathy Sechrist? No one is coming forward. Mike Bulea, B-U-L-E-A? You'll be followed by Candace Stanley.
Well, thank you so much for giving all of us an opportunity to speak up and participate in the process of democracy. I thank those who support, such as myself, the Second Amendment, and I also thank those who disagree with us for coming here and voicing their opinion. I was thinking about a number of issues, but I think, in my opinion, we need to go back to the founders of this country and ask ourselves a simple question. The people that founded this country, what was their vision? The Constitution starts with "we the people," not "with the government." They wanted people to be armed and be able to defend themselves. That worked out very well for, during the War of the Independence. And, America prospered. There is a lot of there's a lot of talk of lack of safety, but I grew up in Eastern Europe, and I can tell you that I don't feel any less safe here. Actually, this is the safest place, for me. And judging the way people immigrate from other continents and from other countries here, I would submit to you that this is the safest country in the world, in spite of the fact that the United States, as a country, is an exception to the rest of the countries in the world, where the right to possess a firearm is pretty much unheard of. So I would like to go back to the vision of the founders, that we the people have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that we have a right to defend ourselves against aggressors, and that we do not want people to come and telling us, no, you don't have the right to do this, you don't have the right to carry so many rounds, because there is no such a thing as too much insurance, coming and telling me 30 bullets is too much, then 10 bullets is too much. So I don't want to, go too far into this, but I think the founding fathers were right. I think we need to go back to the free markets. We need to let people, American people, give them the ability and the right to defend themselves if need be. We know the police officers are unable to respond, the moment you're under attack. And so, we have to help ourselves. We cannot expect 1,000 police officers to basically defend us in any kind of situations. If I'm in a dark alley, if I'm in a situation where I'm under attack, I wish, that there would be a gun next to me, because, that's my first line of defense. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope that you make the right decision, not a popular decision or the one that's based on fear.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
For those of you who weren't here last week, I want to remind you that just as I expect this council to listen to everybody who speaks and give them their attention, I do also expect that of the people in the audience. So even though you may not be in the council chambers, we can hear you, and it is disruptive to our proceedings. Next person I have a card for is Candace Stanley. No one's coming forward. I have Cameron Stanley. Next card, Mark S. Tober. Mark S. Tober or Tauber. All right, no one's coming forward. Mark S. Tober.
make sure we don't stay here till midnight. My name is Mark Tober. I'm a former resident of Los Gatos, and I am president of the Golden State Second Amendment Council. We're a local group here of volunteers on the Second Amendment issues as well as barbecue. So you can tell we're serious about this. Last week, I sat here for almost 2.5 hours listening to people complain about Templar sports. And the common theme amongst all those people was very simple. They tried to hide something. It's a load of hooey. Load of hooey. They could have called themselves Big Five Sporting Goods. There's no gun in that word, in that name, but they sell guns. They could have called themselves Cabela's or any of 10,000 other names. No guns mentioned, but they sell guns. It's a fraud. If there has been any deceit here with regard to Templar sports, it rides squarely on the shoulders of the people who are against Templar sports. They're hiding the fact they don't like the Second Amendment. They don't like firearms. And they should come out and just say it. This country was traumatized by the shooting of more than a dozen innocent children in Connecticut. And unfortunately, far too many people have come out to take advantage of that to push a political agenda. It's disgusting. Chief among them, the President of the United States, and our own Senator Feinstein. The fact of the matter is, all of the laws that they have proposed, they have admitted, will do nothing to stop a Sandy Hook and won't stop the next one. Fact, the only thing that stops a crazy man with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And fact, good guys can't get guns if they don't have stores like Templars to go to. This council needs to make a decision about where the balance of power resides in society. Will it reside in the hands of crazy people with guns or good guys with guns? And if you want the good guys to come to your defense of your communities and schools, you must side with Templar sports. And thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, we've now completed listening to everyone who submitted a card last time. I thank all of you. And I do appreciate the fact that we were here till midnight a week ago, and that we've now heard from some more. And so at this point, the public input is at an end. And as many of you have noted and suggested, it now turns to the council. And once more for the council process, each council member, if he or she desires, has the opportunity to ask questions of staff. And then we will go on with our discussions, et cetera, after that. So, first of all, does any council member have a question of staff? Ms. Jensen.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. First is a ministerial question. In our desk item that we received this afternoon at 3 o'clock, one of the things we got it's a table, essentially. It's titled Regulatory Framework for Los Gatos Commercial Industrial Zone, Draft 211-2013. I'm assuming that that is a proposal, correct?
Mayor, Madam Mayor, members of the council, one of the members of the council asked for something that would show in a matrix or similar format all the various regulatory proposals. So this is staff's attempt over the weekend and today to document that to the best of the information we have available. So the rows show the various types of activity that could occur in the commercial industrial zone. Then the columns show the various regulatory frameworks. The first four are what is. The last one is a reflection of what was included in the staff recommendation last week and this week for further consideration. So the last column is proposed. We believe the middle four columns reflect what is to the best of our knowledge today.
I have a couple more. Do you want me to wait or do you want me to?
Just why don't you go ahead, and if you have about 3 questions, go ahead and finish your questions.
Okay, I'll try to keep it to 3. I asked Mr. Larson this morning regarding documents so that I could understand what constitutes the certificate of use and occupancy for Templar Sports. And I ended up with, I think, 3 documents. 2 of them are an application. One is dated June 21st. It's indicating retail sporting goods as the proposed use. There is one that's dated August 6th, which says the proposed use is a contractor office. And then there is an official-looking document, which is Town of Los Gatos Commercial Certificate of Occupancy, which is dated December 20th, which looks to me like it's a certification of a final inspection for building, but it doesn't indicate what the business is. So I'm just trying to understand, what is the certificate of use and occupancy, and how can we examine something and determine what it is that this building has been certified by the town to do?
A certificate of use and occupancy is a planning document, and that is for a change of use regarding a change of business. The certificate of occupancy, which you had shown as the date of December, that is a building permit final, meaning they can occupy the building. So it's unrelated to the use. It actually has to do with the construction of the building.
Ms. Jensen?
Promise I'll try to make it 3. So I looked at our town codes today, and we have a code section. We have a series of code sections regarding a certificate of use and occupancy. They start with 29.20.060, and 29.2255 gives someone the right to appeal a certificate of use and occupancy on the ground that the use is not allowed in the zone. And then it goes, there's another section that indicates that one could revoke a zoning, grounds for revocation of a zoning approval. And it doesn't seem to list any kind of time limit or criteria. It just indicates that the Planning Commission could have a hearing. So if I could get any guidance on what staff thinks that those code sections mean, I'd appreciate it.
Could you repeat the section for the revocation, please?
The revocation, so the certificate of occupancy starts with 29.20.060, and the appeal rights are at 29.20.255. That's for the certificate of occupancy. The revocation or modification of a zoning approval is at 29.20.310, and then there's grounds for revocation at 29.20.315. And one of those is, I'm sorry, I'm going to talk like a lawyer, section A, paren 3, that the use for which the approval was granted is so exercised as to be detrimental to the public health or safety or to be a nuisance. So I'm just looking for some guidance on the appeal for the certificate of use and occupancy, and when, if ever, the town has dealt with or interpreted the revocation.
Ms. McDuff, did you have a question or was pending?
You know, this is very difficult when none of us are going to be able to look at this. I wonder if we have a Wi-Fi connection in here, if we could put the town code up on the screen, since it's a searchable database, and we could all see. Because it's very difficult to, I'm not going to be able to follow the discussion.
Or I also have copies if you want to put it up on the projector.
I'll defer to staff.
I just think all council members need to have access to this information.
That's acceptable to the mayor if the staff wants to put it up. Ms. Jensen, within the context of what has now been put up, can you restate for me your question that staff is looking into?
My question is whether this process has ever been, to the staff's knowledge, used in the town, and if there's any interpretation that the town has had or the staff has regarding the grounds for revocation, in particular A3, that the use for which the approval was granted is so exercised as to be detrimental to the public health or safety or to be a nuisance.
In terms of if anyone has appealed the decision, I am not aware of any, but it doesn't mean that has not happened. But I've been here almost 30 years, and I don't remember that. And I wouldn't have to research those other sections more, because some sections relate then to other sections of the town code. So I don't think I can immediately answer that question, but if you give me some time, I'll see if there's any sections that relate to other sections.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I was just curious whether the process had been followed by the staff before, so thanks. And Madam Mayor, that's it for my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? All right, seeing none from the other council people, questions of staff? Mr. Larson? Yes. Are you going to respond, or are you going to listen to my question?
We're responding to pieces since we didn't have the code sites before to research. There was, it appears, in 2006, a revocation of 408 North Santa Cruz Avenue. And that was a zoning approval and a modification of a CUP. And that appears to be the one case I see this section of the code being applied. And Ms. Bailey has more information on what that case was.
Well, there was another revocation on Union Avenue as well. So there's been 2 revocations in town.
All right, thank you. Anything else, Ms. Jensen? Go ahead.
I did ask this question of Mr. Larson earlier, and I don't know if it was, I didn't see it in the packet, but if one were to determine that a building was being occupied in violation of the certificate of use and occupancy, what's the consequence of that?
That would be a code enforcement issue.
And what do you mean by code enforcement issue?
If the use was not permitted, then we would have to go through a procedure for them to either become a permitted use or to vacate the facility.
And very briefly, what would the procedure be?
An administrative citation is issued, which gives the person who's violation of the code an opportunity to cure or to go through a process that includes appeal and others. And ultimately, I believe it can go to court action as well.
So generally on code enforcement matters, the town's goal, as directed in the policies by the council, is to achieve compliance and not intended to be for punishment. So staff usually will reach out to any owner, whether it's residential or commercial, to try and gain voluntary cooperation and compliance. If that is not achieved in a reasonable time frame or can't be achieved because the use is inconsistent or not allowed, then as the town manager and planning manager indicated, there are varying degrees and different processes that can be utilized to try and gain voluntary compliance to either remedy the situation or vacate the building, including administrative citations or actual court proceedings if necessary.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
All right, now before I go to my questions, does any other council person have a question or questions? Mr. Brzezinski?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is a question for the attorney. What is the procedure if the council were to request an operating agreement after the fact? And I'm assuming that this would be something to be discussed in whatever motion we have at the end of the meeting. But just kind of clarify for me, what grounds would we have to request the development of an operating agreement with a business that is currently operating legally in the proper zone.
One of the initial staff recommendations from the planning department was to try and gain a voluntary operating agreement with the current owners of Templar Sports. As the council may recall, starting in about 2010 on certain uses in the downtown area, primarily bars or restaurants, that had conditional use permits. As part of the use permit requirement, the council established a criteria to include a operating agreement so that the planning department and the police department could work with the owners of a business to ensure that the day-to-day operations that aren't really governed under land use could be discussed and negotiated and arranged so that it would be consistent with the needs of the surrounding neighborhood and surrounding businesses. What staff had suggested for council to discuss tonight is the possibility, while not a requirement, can't be mandated, but to explore and, if interested, discuss and direct staff to approach the owners of Templar Sport to see if they would be willing to sit down with the various departments of the town, address the issues that the community has raised with respect to these proceedings, and in any way voluntarily agree to abide by certain rules or regulations that address some of the concerns of the community. The process, if the council wants to discuss it, would be to discuss it tonight, direct staff through the town manager to reach out to Templar. There were early indications in a letter from Templar's attorney, as well as representations at the last meeting of council last Monday, that they were willing to talk to town staff. And again, if it's the council's pleasure tonight to discuss that issue and direct staff to explore those options, that's certainly something that staff could reach out. Can't be required, can't be imposed or mandated, but certainly could be explored.
All right, anyone else? Mr. Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor Spector. Over and over again in staff's correspondence, we hear the terminology discretionary or non-discretionary in regards to licenses. Can you explain for the people what is meant by that this act is non-discretionary, that we will give out a license to whoever asks for one?
I'm not usually the one at these meetings taking the mic, but for some reason I seem to be utilizing that tonight. Discretionary permits are any permits that require a decision-making body, like a council, planning commission, design review committee, a historic preservation committee, any of the various committees or commissions established by council, where that decision-making body exercises its judgment prior to any approval, and those approvals are required under the town code or rules and regulations. Depending on the specifics of any given application, discretionary permits may be approved, conditionally approved, or denied. In contrast, ministerial permits are those types of permits which are set up already in the town code, whereby all that's required is conformity with the ordinance before approving that permit or application. We've given the example of a business license, which isn't even a permit. It is a tax that, if under the code in Chapter 14 of the town code, if you fill out the application and provide the information that's required in the town code, then the staff doesn't have any discretion. It doesn't go to any decision-making body. If you meet the requirements that are set forth in the town code, pay the tax, then you get the issuance of the license.
Mr. Vice Mayor?
Based on your description, what would prevent anybody who possesses a current retail designation use certificate from getting language added to their license upon request valid for firearm sales.
If it met the town code requirements, if it was a retail business and they were expanding for gun sales, that is still a retail business, and they would just have to go through the extra requirements to obtain that license.
Madam Mayor, if I might add, obviously they would still have all the federal and state requirements to go through as well before they could do any firearm sales. And we've had at least a half dozen firearms retailers in town in the past, 2 to 3 of them within the last decade. So the business license denotation does not in any way supplant or supersede federal or state requirements, which take precedence. Obviously, the recommendations we've made to the council tonight would be to consider and bring back for your action changes to that for the first time in the town's history.
Further questions? Go ahead.
Thank you. So previously, the firearms licenses that we've issued had language on them that said valid for retail sales of firearms.
As I explained in the staff addendum, we changed our business licensing system in 2008, and only those business licenses that were active from 2008 to 2009 carried forward. So I can answer definitively for firearms retailers that existed solely before 2008. Since then, there have been a number, and I might ask the director if he has additional information. There was an e-commerce site. There was a couple home occupations. The information provided to planning staff in August identified that state law requires a firearms retailer who has a state and federal license to have one of 2 documentations from the town, either a notation on the business license or a letter that says there are no local firearms regulations. The end result is the same, that there's no control by the local town under our local ordinances for firearm sales currently in the town of Los Gatos, or ever as far as we can tell.
You have further questions?
I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
All right. Then let me circle back to myself. I know that the matrix that you prepared was in part in response to questions I've asked, but I just need to go through this. I'm trying to get understanding of what Templar is allowed to do at the current time. And in going through the paperwork that we have, this is what I understand, so just let me know if I'm wrong, that they can sell gun and gun components, that they can repair guns and gun components, they can manufacture guns and gun components, and they can do training. Is there anything that I've left out, or is there anything in that list that is inaccurate?
Obviously, beyond guns, they can sell other goods and items as well. We would argue that their instruction is incidental only, in that there is an administrative policy that specifies what is allowed, and that is detailed under the 4 stars on the bottom. It's no more than 5 students and 1 instructor at a town. So it's limited instruction. For assembly and manufacturing, it's an issue we would need to research more. As you and I had discussed, Mayor, possibly trying to split assembly and manufacturing because they are 2 different actions. We didn't have enough data or information at this time to split those categories, so we have them together. At this point in time, what would be allowed in the way of manufacturing would be determined when they came in for a certificate of use and occupancy and to be reviewed in the zoning category they're in. So to answer your question, yes, firearms and ammunition they could sell. We are questioning whether they could sell explosives under their current town permit. That's why it says under research. We believe they could do incidental repair, and they could do incidental instruction, and they could do certainly assembly of firearms and possibly limited manufacturing, but that's under research as well.
Thank
Mayor,
you.
just to finish that clarification, is some of the additional areas that are not in the current federal firearms license 7 that was issued to Templar Sport by the federal government, by the ATF and DOJ, and as Mr. Larson indicated, that with respect to manufacturing and explosives, it's our understanding that that probably is likely to require additional federal and state licenses that either haven't been applied for or no intent to apply for. So while we can look at what the town code says, we're still needing to clarify with the ATF as to what their requirements would be on that. So at this time, it doesn't appear to town that it is only a town decision, that there may be some state and federal requirements to meet prior to any town licensing.
Thank you. And then, Mr. Larson, following up on a question that I had asked this weekend, we have paperwork that reflects the application of the 3 principles of Templar to the federal government. And does that, I'm assuming they got a license. I don't think we ever saw the license. But assuming that they have a license, does that authorization apply to just the 3 principals, or does it also apply to all the employees who work there?
I will defer to the attorney. She's had discussions with the federal government on that very issue.
In response to the questions from the community as well as the council over the past few days, our offices reached out to the ATF and Department of Justice for the federal government, as well as the Department of Justice for the California state, to clarify some of the code sections that have been researched. And it's our current understanding that the federal firearms license has to be applied for by the owners, the principals of the business. With respect to the employees, there is a state requirement that the principals and owners of the business also go through a state process, and that then if the state completes that process, they issue what's called a certificate of eligibility, and that was provided in the staff report last week for one of the primary owners, as was reported to us in the business. Since that time, we've done further research and understand that at the owner's discretion, the firearms dealer owner's discretion, they under state law have the ability to also have each of their employees go through a state process for a certificate of eligibility. That state process includes the State Department of Justice doing, checking their records to ensure that the applicant is not prohibited from owning, possessing, handling any firearms. It's our understanding that that is a discretionary option of each of the firearms retailers. And in this case, Templar Sports actually did require their employees to go through that process, that state process, and they have obtained for their employees, current employees, that certificate of eligibility clearance through the California State Department of Justice.
And if I might add, Madam Mayor, the documentation for that is again on the regulatory framework, attachment 16. The second half of the retail sales category talks about the individuals involved in retail sales. So ownership and licensees are required to have both federal and state approval, and then ministerial approval by the town through the business license. Employees, as you'll see, is asterisk only under state approval, not under federal or town. And as the asterisk describes, it's discretionary for retailers to require their employees to have a COE, and Templar has told us they're going to require their employees to have a COE. So this is the documentation for what the attorney just shared with you.
All right, thank you. And then one last question at this point. In the paperwork that we've received, it would appear that the town business license predated the federal license. And one, is that accurate? And two, is that the acceptable process?
As has been explained by the attorney, the business license is a tax. It's not a license, and if a business wants to come in and pay their tax early, they can certainly do that for their intended use. However, that does not supplant regulatory requirements, be it federal, state, or planning. So the business cannot operate until all of the requirements are met. And in fact, as noted in the detailed chronology, Templar, like many businesses in town, paid their 2013 business license fees in December. November and December is when most of our renewed business licenses are paid, but they're not active and used until 2013. And in fact, they're mailed out the first week or second week of the new year. And I would ask to the finance director if there's any elaboration on that point.
I'm Steve Conway, Director of Finance. We received approximately 4,000, Madam Mayor, 4,000 business license are processed annually. Templar Sports that transaction was handled as all of our transactions. Applicant brings into the counter. We refer it to planning department for any approvals. If those approvals are made, then our process as it stands right now is to many businesses receive same day. I'd say the majority of ours is same day or the next day approval on business licenses. As the manager stated, it's a tax, and we do not turn down revenue for the town, but we are not a regulatory function in that regard.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Any other council person? Ms. McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. One of the questions that we asked the staff to provide over the last few days is more information about moratorium, what the possibilities are, what the process is, and so on. Since we have not had a staff report on that, we just have the written report. I wonder if you could go through it very briefly so that the public is aware of what's involved.
We did provide a brief reference in the addendum for tonight's council meeting that was distributed to council and the public on Friday, but there are legal nuances to the moratoria, so we would like to ask the attorney to provide more detail as requested by the council.
Generally in California, law allows temporary moratoriums for land uses for any future uses. Under California law, the moratoriums are adopted for generally to preserve the status quo, not to look backwards and try and apply them retroactively. So in this situation, one of the options that council would have tonight to discuss is not with respect to any existing business, but whether or not they wanted staff to review and research and bring back any temporary moratoriums for any new uses related to firearms, whether it's the retail sales of firearms, whether it's the future manufacturing or the retail sales of explosive devices, or any of the other issues that the community has raised about going forward. So staff, council could direct staff to look at that and bring back a temporary moratorium to prohibit on a temporary basis until the council had time to review and study the matter further any new uses.
And Madam Mayor, if I may, the key line from the staff report is moratoria may be adopted to address temporary prohibitions of new uses that may be in conflict with the contemplated zoning proposal that the town council plans to study. So if the council were to proceed with the staff recommendations to consider either conditional use process for firearm sales or limitation or designation of which zoning categories may be appropriate, or a prohibition on home occupation, firearm sales, any of those that were in the staff recommendations, that would seem to meet the clause that it could also then, as a future land use regulation you're going to consider, you want to consider more immediately a moratoria to put into place until that future land use regulation is considered and acted upon.
Thank you. Ms. McNutt? All right, further questions? Okay, Ms. Jensen.
Sorry. One is a follow-up to the mayor's question regarding the matrix. I think I understood Mr. Larson to indicate that under current town code, that by obtaining a business license, which has been described as a tax, that Templar can sell firearms, ammunition, repair firearms, and manufacture. Am I correct in my understanding of what was said?
We said we thought assembly and manufacturing is an issue to be considered. And I should highlight again, repair, instruction, assembly, manufacturing are all incidental, with retail being the primary use.
Follow up? So when I look at the various applications, licenses, and the minutes from the Development Review Committee, I don't see that discussed. So if I were a resident of the town, a resident from out of town, how would it be that I would determine that that business was now able to engage in those activities, and how would I determine whether they were doing something that was not allowed under their certificate of use or their business license?
Before asking Ms. Bailey to elaborate, I just wanted to clarify the DRC, the Development Review Committee, did not look and was not prescribed to look at use at all. Their only role was to look at architecture and site. That was the sole application that came to them, was architecture and site for minor exterior modifications. As for the elaboration on how residents would respond, it would largely be a code enforcement concern they would raise, and staff would follow up, as Ms. Bailey will indicate.
Yes, so if there is a question, the applicant can typically clarify with staff what the permitted uses are. As Mr. Larson had indicated, repair is an incidental use. The small classes is an incidental use, and the small scale assembly, because it is a light industrial zone, so those are permitted uses in a light industrial zone. It's a commercial industrial zone, so those are permitted uses there. And then we do react on neighborhood concerns if somebody has a question. If someone is not following their business plan, staff can take a look at that and respond and take the appropriate actions as necessary.
One final follow-up?
Go ahead.
When Ms. Propp was describing non-discretionary and discretionary, and just in Mr. Larson's response regarding the role of the Development Review Committee, one of the things that's asserted in the minutes for the I'm going to say DRC because I'm going to stumble over Development Review Committee, is that it determined that the architecture inside or the changes to the building were consistent with our commercial design guidelines. But the commercial design guidelines also say, for example, that they are there to protect property owner investments by discouraging inappropriate adjacent development and to ensure that new development shall be sensitive to its location adjacent to residential neighborhoods. So I'm just curious, if that's in our commercial design guidelines, why isn't that considered in the DRC meeting?
When you're referencing development, are you referencing the use, or are you representing new development in terms of architectural changes?
I just took that out of the purposes for the LM zone from the commercial design guidelines.
Okay, the commercial design guidelines is for developments. That means new construction and alterations. It does not deal with the actual use.
Okay, but if they change the building, that's an alteration. And I'm confused about that we have language in our commercial design guidelines which I think I'm hearing is superfluous, that they're not considering, and that they're only considering those things that have to do with the actual structure of the building.
It does look at the neighborhood, and if you look at the LM zone has its own commercial design guidelines, and the intent of the LM district guidelines is to provide flexibility for the retention of light industrial uses. So that in looking at the commercial changes out there, we are looking at maintaining a light industrial type neighborhood, the character there. So we wouldn't be making alterations to make it look like the C2 zone, which is the historic downtown area. And so it's supposed to maintain the small-scale, low-key character of the district. So we did take that into consideration in looking at the exterior changes.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Mr. Brzezinski.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going back to the moratorium issue. In your advice document to us dated February 8th, Madam Attorney, you talked about the following, and I'd just like a clarification for our purposes. State law allows for temporary land use controls and growth measures based on factual documented health, safety, and welfare concerns through adoption of a temporary moratorium. And factual documented is underlined. Could you expand on what that particular sentence means in terms of any intention on council's part to evaluate a moratorium in this context?
In general, if the council were to discuss and direct staff to bring back a moratorium for future, a temporary moratorium for future firearm uses, then staff would need to do the requisite research and study to bring back sufficient evidence that would support any council findings that there's a reason to adopt a temporary moratorium. For example, that when this council and many other communities looked at medical marijuana, when staff brought back a temporary moratorium, they brought back studies and other documents that were available to support the need to prohibit them on a temporary basis until the council could study future land uses and adopt those permanent regulations. So all that the staff was intending is to remind council is that any moratorium requires a legislative findings, just like you make on any other land use matter, and staff it would be incumbent on them to see if that kind of evidence or documents or information is available to support that type of a temporary moratorium.
Mr. Brzezinski?
So if I can interpret you correctly, if that were the council's intention to explore this, then we would instruct staff to provide us the requisite findings that would validate the question of health, safety, and welfare?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Ms. Jensen.
Ms. Propp, I did ask you that same question, I think Friday, perhaps. It's my understanding, and I just want to make sure that your answer is, that I understand your answer consistently with what your response to my question was, is that the support for a temporary ordinance or a moratorium can be based on, for example, testimony that we receive at a council meeting. It can be based upon anecdotal information, news reports, conflict in laws, etc. Is that correct?
There are a variety of different standards, and California courts have given local decision-making bodies great discretion in how they evaluate that information that comes before them to make those legislative findings. So you are correct that there are several types of information that can be supplied to the decision makers, and in this case the council, for their consideration before adopting a temporary moratorium.
Ms. Jensen? Anyone else as far as question goes? Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I have a couple different questions, two totally different topics. First is regarding the license, again, that we issued on August 29th. And just looking at the federal firearms law, section 12071, It says no license shall be granted by a local entity prior to evidence of a federal license being issued and a couple other documents being issued. So I was just wondering, under what jurisdiction did we act to issue that license?
I don't have the federal regulations in front of me, but again, under California law, for a business tax, any local agency that has adopted a code such as this council, the prior council that adopted the business tax, is that it is a ministerial process by which that if you follow the town code requirements, that you fill out the form, you indicate what your expected revenue is, what the category of operations or uses that you're going to do. It's calculated what your business tax is. You pay that tax, then the town has the obligation to issue the business tax, and in California it's called a license. It is not a discretionary permit or license that is subject to hearings or further review.
Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. So I understand the idea behind a retail sales, a use tax license, and being non-discretionary for selling things like hats and dresses and ice cream. But when I read this federal firearms law, to me it seems like this requires a greater responsibility, that it's not necessarily just a use tax certificate, that it requires a different category, a special category, of which we don't have in the town of Los Gatos currently. So I have a deep concern that everyone in the town currently who is selling toys or hats or whatever could come in tomorrow morning and say to our clerk, could you add to my license valid for retail firearm sales? And that's very problematic to me. So I wanted to follow up on something that one of the speakers said about an emergency ordinance. Can you discuss what is involved with adopting an emergency ordinance to prevent that from possibly happening?
Two questions or two comments first. Staff clearly concurs with the concern for the future as based on our recommendations to add firearms regulations to the town code for the first time. They have not existed ever in the town's history, and we're recommending to you for consideration that they be added just to prevent that on a go-forward basis. Second, the whole issue of the two mechanisms the state provides, it's not a federal government requirement, but that the state provides to document compliance with local regulations. One way is to modify the firearms license. My direction to staff will be, pending council direction, that in the future we use the alternative mechanism until new ordinances are in place that says the town does not have any local restrictions in our town code on firearm sales, because that is indeed the truth. We do not currently have any restrictions in the town code on firearm sales, and what we've proposed are changes to that. The interim step before we can bring back those code changes to you is to consider a moratoria on any new use or expanded firearm sales in the town. The attorney has described that process in writing. We described it in our staff report, and she could probably describe it again tonight. Madam Attorney?
Again, as indicated, that if the council so directs, then staff would do additional study and research and bring back a temporary moratoria. It's an ordinance. It would be subject to public hearing and before this council, and we can do that based on council's direction, provide council information as you request or direct tonight, and bring that back. Those types of ordinance do require a 4/5 vote. There are certain noticing requirements. I'm not sure how detailed you want me to go into the process and whether, how much more you need us to describe the process.
Well, it's the first time I've heard of it, so 4/5 vote is understandable. If this council were to adopt, or the idea was put on the table here this evening, when will those laws take effect? Would that be immediately as of the vote?
If it's brought back as an urgency, it does go into effect immediately. The town then has 45 days in which to bring it, keep it in place until staff brings back additional information and reports to the council. At that point, if the council still needs more time to study the land use issues, the moratorium can be extended up for another 10 months and 15 days, and then at the most, the outside is that the state of California allows one more extension of a moratorium up for another year. So the combined total of the different extensions never exceeds 2 years, and it's usually much shorter because during those different extension steps, staff would have to bring back updated reports as to information for the council to consider, so that then you can decide whether to adopt any permanent land use requirements or regulations.
Mr. Larson?
Yes, and for the public and council, I would refer you to item 11 on page 5 of last Friday's staff report, which describes the steps for a moratorium as we distributed to you on Friday. The town council did implement this process a few years ago related to medical marijuana dispensaries, and we're prepared to follow that same process tonight at your direction.
Thank you. Mr. Brzezinski?
Just a point of clarification. Am I correct in assuming that this has to be an agendized item? That is, the moratorium would have to be agendized. It cannot be initiated without it being reflected on the agenda for a noticed meeting?
That's correct.
I'm not that concerned about people who sell toys who've observed last week's marathon being interested in selling guns at this point in time. But I think that it would be very good that we clarify what the exact protocol is, so that we can move forward on this if we so desire.
What we'd be looking for from council is direction to bring back to you, or to research and to bring back to you whatever documentation and factual findings. The council will have to make findings on a 4/5 vote, as outlined by the attorney, of the need and necessity for a moratorium, and that would come back to you on a duly noticed meeting following the requirements for adopting a moratorium. It's a higher bar than a typical council action.
Let me follow up on that. Notice myself before the two of you. Correct me if I'm wrong. I was under the impression that besides the health, safety bases for a moratorium, that there was also one that could be put into effect if a zoning change or some kind of land use change was also pending. So if somebody could clarify that for me.
The reason that council would adopt, and the conditions that they could adopt a moratorium or moratoria, if there's several areas for study, is that you have to make a finding that there's health, safety, and welfare concerns, and that the council intends to study it so that it will conform to local land use rules in the general plan or zoning code. So it's not an either or, it's a both.
Thank you. Ms. McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to clarify for everyone on this side of the dais and on that side that as far as I'm interpreting this, we actually can take no action tonight other than to direct staff to do something or other? Because nothing has been agendized, as I understand it. Is that correct?
Correct. This is to provide direction to staff to study, research, and bring back for subsequent council consideration in a duly noticed meeting.
Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. So the idea of that emergency ordinance doesn't apply to what Council Member McNutt just said. Is that correct?
Moratoriums can be adopted in two manners. One is on an urgency. It's called an urgency ordinance, and there is one process to follow for that, and that can be done. Also requires notice at a separate meeting, and then it would go into effect immediately if it met the requirements and there was a 4/5 vote of this council. It would be in effect for 45 days until staff could bring back the next extension that would then be available for council's consideration to extend for another 10 months. The other process is that if the council can't find the urgency in which to do it, moratoria can be adopted just like any other ordinance on 10 days published notice, first reading and a second reading, and the normal process that all ordinances follow.
And if I may add, Mayor.
Mr. Larson.
This is all state law-driven procedures. They're not unique to the town of Los Gatos.
Thank you. Ms. Jensen.
Are there any special noticing requirements for the emergency ordinance? I'm actually looking at it, California Government Code 65858, and it says, without following the procedures otherwise required prior to the adoption of a zoning ordinance, the legislative body, blah, 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 may adopt an interim ordinance. So I'm assuming that we need notice, but not as we would for if we were going through an entire adoption of, for example, a new zoning code related to firearm sales. So, for example, could we, if we were so inclined, could we notice could we notice a possible consideration of adoption of a moratorium for our next council meeting on February 19th, for example? Or is there some special requirement for how many days?
There is the requirement to document and prepare for you the findings necessary, and there will be research and work required for that above and beyond the notification. Whether it's for next Monday or 2 Mondays following, I think is an open question.
Ms. Jensen.
What I'm actually asking is there any prohibition or any requirement in the California Government Code for a noticing, not for the time that the staff will take, but something in the code that requires a length of time?
I don't have the code in front of me. If you give me just a minute, we'll be able to respond to that question.
I'm not going to have anybody else ask a question while you're doing that. Best to fill up the space with talk. I will do that. As you might gather from what you're hearing, what is going to happen here is after we finish asking questions of staff, and obviously that we haven't finished asking questions of staff, then we will get to that portion of the hearing or the meetings where we will be having discussion and giving direction to staff. As staff has indicated in response to our questions, we will be making no decisions tonight, but we will be giving direction to staff for future decisions. Mr. Larson?
Yes. While the attorney is researching that question, if I could go back to one prior question with an additional comment, and it was regarding the commercial design guidelines and the architecture and site application. When you look at section 1 of the commercial design guidelines, it deals with architecture, design, exterior. It doesn't deal with use. Development, as the planning manager indicated, is for the physical development, not the type of development. and that's what's considered with the architecture and site at the Design Review Committee.
Now we are looking at you.
No pressure here. The notice requirement is in Government Code 65090, and it does require publication in the newspaper proceeding 10 days prior to the hearing. So that will require some delay in order to meet those noticing requirements.
Ms. Jensen?
Just to clarify, if I look at 65858, the noticing requirement that you are referring to seems to me to be an extension of the original 45 days.
Sure. If you've got the entire code, and I don't know if you have a sheet that you might want to hand to the clerk to put on the overhead, but if you look at 65858 section B, about an interim ordinance may be adopted by 4/5 vote following notice pursuant to that same section 65090, and a public hearing shall be So again, even on that urgency basis, there has to be some sort of published notice prior to that hearing.
Thank you.
Other questions of council?
There was one prior that we just found, urgency ordinance, and that was for the personal service businesses, and the council adopted an urgency interim ordinance regarding approval of applications for personal service businesses. And again, that urgency ordinance allowed then the code sections to be changed, and that's why personal services are regulated in the code. Firearms are not yet, but if we pursue this path, firearms will be regulated in the future.
Thank you. Mr. Vice Mayor, did you have a question?
Just want to find out if there's any more pending firearms requests.
Not aware of any.
How do we know that?
We have not had any inquiries
All right.
regarding additional businesses.
Thank you.
All right, other questions? I am seeing none. And so now we will go to the next step. As I previously mentioned, we will have discussion and direction to staff. Before I do that, I have a question of council as to whether or not council has a conflict of interest before we go into the discussion and direction relating to this matter. Conflict of interest defined as a financial interest, a bias or prejudice that can't be set aside, or ownership of property 500 feet near Templar. Anybody raise their hand? They have a conflict of interest? Seeing no one, we will now go into our discussion and direction to staff. Ms. Jensen.
May I ask a procedural question? Are we simply going to make comments to staff regarding direction, or are we going to do this by way of motions by the council?
This mayor is looking for motions for direction to staff. Does staff want to weigh in on that?
Would it be helpful to have the staff recommendations on the screen for the audience as well as the council?
Quite frankly, I don't care. It's okay if staff wants it.
Yes, the last slide, the 5 bullets.
All right, council. Mr. Przynski.
Mayor, I'll start. In the staff report this is the staff report for tonight's meeting, 2/11. On page 1 of that staff report, there was a recommendation of 6 different possible options for the staff to research and prepare potential ordinance and policy changes. I think it's necessary that we have ordinance and policy changes. I think it's clear that the the code as currently stated is deficient in this regard. There is a strong feeling in the community regarding this issue, but I would say there's a strong feeling on both sides of the issue. Okay? This isn't a one-sided point of view. And we've all been following this very carefully. I am sure most of my battery life in my iPhone is gone now, given the number of emails I've been reading all day long today and through the weekend and prior. And people have taken a very serious orientation towards this, very, I think, a very thoughtful and deliberative orientation to what this means for our community. And there are conflicting values. And I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that when we look at our community, that it's a heterogeneous grouping of people who have a great deal of concern about the well-being of our town, about how we operate as a community, about the way we care for each other, how families are able to develop, how children are able to thrive, and how we're able to live really a small town life. But this doesn't mean that there's one point of view. And I think I've said it more than once in deliberations over the last 14 years. It's never a question of just black and white. It's always a question of competing values. And I think we've been given in the last couple of weeks a strong orientation towards competing values, that each of which has to be evaluated, each of which has to be accommodated in some way, shape, or form. Anyone who feels like there's only one direction to take, I think, is probably not listening to the entire community. And so with that in mind, I do believe that you know, when you realize that we discovered this issue in our town code because of this application, because of this business coming forward, I would say anyone who's been on council for the last 30 years could have, at a certain point in time, found this in the code and said, wait a second, this is weak. Because it's been sitting there. This is not a new piece of legislation. It's been sitting there the entire time, and somehow we have not had any issue that's brought it to the surface until this issue came to us. And I think that's how most of the things that are in code get altered. And they are situational, they are historic, and usually what happens in our experience on council is it takes an issue to raise the issue. It's kind of ironic that you know, we're at this point tonight, but I do think that we have been given sufficient evidence that, first of all, there was no malfeasance, even though there was some accusation of that. And I am absolutely convinced of that as I've read all the documentation. Second of all, that the law was followed, and we are a government of law. Governments that don't follow law are called anarchy. In this particular case, I think the response of the people to this issue has appropriately raised opportunities for the council to take a look at the law and to make sure that the law fits our community in 2013. And with that in mind, I'm going to make a recommendation, Madam Mayor, and I'll make the recommendation. I could theoretically make it as a motion for purpose of discussion, but the recommendation is going to be to take those 6 items as indicated on the overhead.
I'm going to suggest if you're going to do that, make it a motion and let's discuss it.
So for purposes of discussion, my motion is going to be to move the staff to research and prepare potential ordinance and policy changes regarding these 6 items. Designated which land uses are appropriate for sales of firearms and ammunition, require a conditional use permit for sales of same, restrict home occupation permits for sales of same, establish a police permit requirement for dealers of firearms and ammunition, require identification checks for the sale of ammunition, and require the reporting of lost or stolen firearms. That's my motion, and then I do want us to discuss.
All right, we have a motion. Do we have a second? Ms. McKnight, is that a query or a second?
I'm trying to think through procedurally here. Would the maker of the motion also consider including in the motion directing staff to come back with the moratorium at the next earliest convenience?
I would include that. I appreciate that, that recommendation.
Okay, so if the combination of a moratorium and moving forward with these looking at six new policy, then I would second the motion.
Right, we have a motion and a second, and the motion includes that the staff come back with a language for a moratorium on, and that I will ask the maker and seconder of the motion for new or expanded uses.
That would be the intention.
Yes.
Seconder? All right. So now we have a motion and a second on the table for discussion. Mr. Brzezinski.
I think it appropriate that we evaluate the significance of each of these in a context that allows us to thoroughly vet what are the outcomes. The motion does not assume that the outcome from staff's review will guarantee that all or any one of these is moved forward by council. But I think what we are looking at right now is a lack of information, a lack of substantive data that we can use to make a good, thoroughgoing evaluation of these for purposes of the outcome. And the outcome is the benefit of the community. The outcome is the appropriate acknowledgement of the values of the community. And so for that, I don't see anything here that I can say would not be appropriate for us to evaluate. And I would hope that we can move this forward with as much efficiency as possible, even though I know we are very, very I'm getting overcommitted to those things that we're asking of staff. But I think this is something that definitely needs to be fast-tracked.
Further, Ms. McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. When I first heard about this, I would have bet any amount of money that we had something in our code that said you can't have a gun store in town. I mean, any amount of money. And hold up the town code. I don't use the printed one anymore because this is what it looks like, So I use the one that's online because you can do a search and it's just so much faster. Any of you can do a search on anything and see what the actual law is. And I kept going back over it. I just would have assumed, as many of you did, that we had some law on the books that would prohibit this or control it. I remember a couple years ago, we overturned an ordinance in the code that prohibited you from throwing a ball in the street. I mean, that was left over from, who would ever guess that something like that would be in there, and this is not. So how this got overlooked, I don't know. But it did, and so now we can take corrective action going forward if that is the will of council as we go forward on this. I know that it's going to be a challenge for staff to come up with the rationale for the moratorium, but I do think that it's important to give some sense of comfort and peace to the community that is so afraid right now and so emotional. And so, knowing that a toy store can't decide to add firearms or any other coming in while we go through this process of developing the new law, I think is very important. There was someone tonight who said, the council has to make a decision on where the balance of power resides in this society. It's like, whoa, I didn't know the Los Gatos Town Council had that kind of power. I know we are not in a position to actually make a determination on Second Amendment rights, on gun control. There's all kinds of conversations about those going on at the state level and at the federal level. Our job is land use and figuring out what is appropriate land use and policy for this community, given the constraints and the allowances that we have from state and federal government. So this conversation is going to continue. I expect I will see many or most of you back here when we talk about the moratorium. Certainly as staff develops proposals for this, I know we're going to hear from many of you, pro and con, on each one of those 6 points or any others. But we have to stay focused, I think, on what our job is, and to take the corrective action that reflects what the community and the council thinks is right for Los Gatos going forward. So that's why I think this motion is a good one at this time.
Further discussion. Ms. Jensen.
First, I have a question for the maker of the motion and the seconder. Mr. Councilperson Brzezinski listed a number of items to consider, and my question is, are you intending that to be a non-exhaustive list? So, for example, would you include distance of a business from a park or a school, a daycare center, or a private school, etc.?
That's an excellent question, and indeed, I mean, we actually have an example in our packet of a comprehensive land use and conditional use permit document, I think from the city of Lafayette, that is for our purposes. My assumption is that when we give this to staff, the expectation is that they're going to do exhaustive research. What comes of it, we will have the opportunity to pick and choose depending on whether we feel it actually is appropriate to the community. But the short answer is yes, indeed.
Madam Mayor.
All right. So let me then go to Ms. McNutt.
My understanding was the motion that this is the 6 starting points, and there may be other elements that staff, as they're doing the research, could explore, and how you define what land uses zones are most appropriate, to me, would include proximity to other uses. So I think this is the starting point of the conversation.
All right, so I hear the maker of the motion and the seconder saying that issues such as distance from other uses will be considered. Ms. Jensen, does that answer your question?
Yes, and I have one other clarifying question, which is, I'm assuming that bullet number 2 assumes a public process in any other assuming there's an adoption of a CUP, that it assumes a public process?
I assume that, Mr. Brzezinski?
Yeah, I think that's a given with our conditional use permit process, that brings it into the public forum. Had we had this in place prior to the current situation, then that would have been part and parcel of how we evaluated this particular application.
Ms. McNutt?
Yes.
All right, further discussion. Ms. Jensen?
I just wanted to make a comment and then make some suggestions regarding findings for a moratorium. Thank you all for coming to speak. We appreciate all of your viewpoints. I hope that those of you who spoke in favor of the Second Amendment realize that we all up here recognize that there is a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, that what we do here tonight or in the future doesn't implicate the Second Amendment. In fact, the cases that some of you cited, District of Columbia versus Heller, et cetera, by their very terms indicate that those decisions do not cast doubt on a local community's ability to enact laws that impose conditions or qualifications on the commercial sale of firearms. So this is a land use issue, and even when land use implicates First Amendment rights, our courts have allowed governments to make reasonable restrictions as long as there are reasonable alternative means to exercise those rights. So this is a land use decision. That said, that it's a land use decision, echoing what Mr. Brzezinski said, what should have happened here? There should have been a public process. As a planning commissioner for many, many years, there have been several occasions when our planning staff has decided to bring matters to the Planning Commission for a public hearing, even though they could be approved by the Development Review Committee, even though they met every single regulation and every single specification in the town code. That's been done. I've sat on many hearings where that's been done, and I'm very sorry that it didn't happen in this case. And I think there was indications that it should have happened in this case. So it's a shame that we've come to these two meetings when there could have been a discretionary call to bring it through a public process. That said, here we are. This councilperson has done just a lot of looking at our various regulations and ordinances in the town of Los Gatos, and I really have to conclude that I don't think there's something that can be done retroactively. I think there can be something be done proactively, and that is the interim ordinance, so I'm going to support the motion for that. And in fact, the California law allows us to enact such an ordinance to protect the public safety, health, and welfare, and may prohibit any uses that may be in conflict with a contemplated zoning proposal that is being considered or studied, or the town council intends to consider or study. And certainly the proposals that we have on the board are things that would be in conflict with our current ordinances and general plan. And Madam Mayor, finally, I'd like to suggest for the staff a few findings.
Before you go there,
Okay.
We have a motion on the table,
I'm sorry.
and we are considering that motion.
Yes, sorry.
Is this above and beyond that?
If I can suggest findings in the course of discussion about the motion, I would do that now. If it's not appropriate to do that, I won't do that now.
All right, we have a part of your motion, Mr. Przinski, is the moratorium. Is that correct?
Yes, but I think that if it's appropriate, Madam Mayor, if we can call the vote and then include any items by way of recommendations to staff, because that's what I think really we're talking, because I have something else I wanted to say about recommendation to staff as well.
All right, so we will not go there yet, Ms. Jensen. We will stay with the motion that we have. Before I see if the vice mayor or the mayor have anything to say, I would like staff to repeat the motion for us.
The motion is to approve staff recommendation as presented in the original staff report and reported and repeated and reprinted in the addenda for today, with the addition of a seventh item to bring back as soon as possible council consideration of a moratoria during the consideration of these study items. Staff is assuming in the maker's motion that it was an urgency moratoria. You'd like us to consider not the regular process moratoria.
That's correct.
Okay.
Ms. McNutt? Absolutely. Yes. And in your representation of their motion or presentation of the motion, one of the things that came up is a distance from other uses, and I'd like that stated expressly, even though it might be included in one of those line items.
And it was stated expressly in the first staff report, but it wasn't listed separately because it would have been included in items 1 or 2. Listing it expressly is certainly appropriate and reflects what was in the original staff report as well.
All right, further discussion. Mr. Vice Mayor.
I'd like to echo some of Council Member Jensen's comments. Thank you all for coming and participating in the public process. As we all stood here tonight and we said the Pledge of Allegiance, I think that's what this is all about. There's probably not one of us in here who wouldn't help our fellow man in a crisis, despite our divisive views on some issues here that we've expressed. But that's what America's all about. I agree that it's always easier to put the public process first. I'm hoping in the future that our staff will inform us a little sooner about these important issues coming forward. As I look through the documentation, it took the town manager's office 74 days to tell this town council about a pending firearms and sporting goods retailer. after the chief of police mentioned that there would be a gun shop in town because one of his employees was looking into that. So I'm just looking forward to the future and hoping that as we move forward as a community, united as a community, we can work together and establish some legislation. Thank you.
All right, and I will also be supporting the motion. I've said it earlier today. I said it last time, a week ago. I want to commend the public. I want to commend you for your input. I want to commend you for your professionalism. And as the person who is overseeing these meetings, I truly appreciate you. I appreciate the input you've given us, not only the probably about 100 speakers over the last 2 meetings, but the many, many hundreds of emails that we have received. I really, I like the engagement that you have demonstrated. You've also demonstrated that there were a lot of issues involved. As Ms. McNutt pointed out, some of these might not be town issues, some of these might not be local issues, but you brought a lot to our plate and gave us a lot to consider, and I thank you for that. You also raised issues and concerns about the process, about the way we got from June of 2012 to February of 2013. And I think there are issues to be examined there. And I looked at those, quite frankly, very carefully. But I was not able to find anything that happened that was wrong under our policies, our rules, or our laws. And so therefore, I came here as I listened to my colleagues, looking at what can we do going forward. And this motion for me encompasses what we can do going forward. So again, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add? Mr. Brzezinski.
Yes, I think while we're giving the accolades to the public, I think it's important to keep something in mind that we live in a time that's very contentious, and it's really difficult for people of differing points of view to sit in the same room and to be, in some ways, engaged civilly with each other. How many examples do we have of this nationwide, and wherein people really kind of demonize those with other points of view and then do not allow them basically to have their say. And the First Amendment is the First Amendment. And it says, we're gonna listen to each other. And I think this has been a very difficult period of time for Los Gatos. I have not been able to go anywhere in town without having someone talk to this issue from one side or the other, okay? And, you know, it's also kind of exciting that we've seen people in this room these last 2 sessions, some of whom we've never seen before. Some of you are veterans of council politics. Some of you are new to the game, and I guess my request is this, that we stay in the game, that we continue to observe what goes on, that we not absent ourselves because now there's not a hot button issue. But our democracy in this town really requires all points of view to be expressed. And you know, the fact that we were able to sit together for these two Monday nights with differing points of view and with people who are not just members of Los Gatos community, but members who are observant of our community and have an interest in a particular perspective, can come together, can share those thoughts, and can leave not necessarily satisfied with the outcome, but satisfied with the fact that we were able to dialogue. And I think that's the value of what we've done these last two Monday nights. So you know, I think that once we've taken the vote, if we have a couple more comments, I do want to make a couple more recommendations to staff. And I also want to commend the mayor for being in charge, because I've been in a lot of regional bodies up and down the state, and I tell you, a lot of it has to go with the person who sits in the center seat and how he or she actually takes care of making sure that the process works. And accolades to Mayor Spector for this.
Thank you. And here I would normally gavel you down for clapping. Before I call the question, Mr. Larson, a date, I would like this to have a date certain. I understand from your 10-day statement, it won't be the 19th.
Yes. The moratorium, I believe the earliest we could bring it back would be the March 4th meeting. And at your meeting next week for the mid-year budget review, we'll be discussing the scheduling of the rest of the staff work reflected in this report.
And just for clarification, in response to Councilmember Jensen's, there may be some latitude in the state code for bringing it back with either little or less notice. If the council were to so desire that we were able to support bringing back an urgency moratorium sooner, we would certainly try and do that. But that means then it would just show up on an agenda on Friday and then be considered by the council on Monday. If that wouldn't allow for, it would be the normal notice that council gets on other matters, not on usually public hearing matters. But we'd be happy to research that and bring it back as soon as possible, if at all available to us.
I appreciate what you're saying, but I didn't understand it.
Okay,
so are we getting this on March 4th or not?
We can bring it back by March 4th. If there's any way we can bring it back sooner, we'll certainly make every attempt to do so.
To bring it back at next Monday's meeting, if it's allowed under the noticing that Councilwoman Jensen and the attorney talked about, would require a Friday notice only for a Monday action on a moratorium.
All right, just give you up, it's Tuesday.
Tuesday, excuse me.
All right, so you're saying that you might be able to bring it back Tuesday?
There's a chance we
If
may be
not-
able to bring it back Tuesday, otherwise March 4th.
All right, March 4th. Ms. Jensen?
To the extent that that was in response to my question, I think it's more important that we state a date today, and if that's March 4th, so that everybody knows when it is.
Then I'm going with March 4th. Mr. Brzezinski, Ms. McNutt?
Yes.
It is March 4th. Further discussion? All right, seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Passes unanimously. Thank you. And I know before we leave this discussion, Mr. Brzezinski?
And I think Councilwoman Jensen wanted also to make a recommendation, but I'll make mine first. It's a question of an operating agreement that was discussed at the beginning of this meeting. If I can make a recommendation, and if we get nods all around, this is not a motion, but a recommendation to explore that with the Templar Sports representatives, and work through that so that we can have a greater internal control on what is going to occur. That would be my recommendation.
All right, we have a recommendation that the staff explore an operating agreement discussion. All right, well then I'll pop in here. I am not a fan of operating agreements because I like things reviewed by the Planning Commission and the council, and my experience has been operating agreements are evaluated at a staff level. So for me, that doesn't mean you can't consider it, but I'm just not a big fan of it, and I wouldn't want it to slow down the March 4th. Further discussion. Ms. Jensen?
I agree with the mayor. I've raised issues about operating agreements before, and not to suggest that this is the case, but I can see that that may present a particular problem given that the operating agreement is with our police department.
Further discussion? Mr. Vice Mayor?
I will echo those comments made by Councilwoman Jensen.
All right. So
Madam Mayor, if I could just clarify.
Mr. Brzezinski.
I mean, I would be very open to the possibility of an operating agreement evaluated and then reviewed by council if that would be possible. I don't disagree with the concerns about creating an operating agreement, but I would like to have an opportunity to get inside the room and to, kind of draw a conclusion. And I am not averse to the staff making, that the entree and having the dialogue. And I would very definitely like to see what kind of parameters could be put in place with the dialogue. But I want to recognize the fact that this is going to be something that we do not have in front of us, and if there's no desire for our council majority to have that kind of internal discussion with the applicant or with the owner to come to some conclusions that are acceptable to us and to them about how they work on a day-to-day basis and what happens inside the doors, then I'll withdraw the recommendation. But I do think that it has some merit for us to be able to have that discussion with the applicant.
Further discussion, Ms. McNutt.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I just want to clarify that the operating agreement that Mr. Brzezinski's talking about is a voluntary operating agreement. So it's not the same as the operating agreements that we are requiring, or we have required on a couple of occasions as an adjunct to a conditional use permit. What I heard from public testimony was a lot of concern about things I know absolutely nothing about, and how much gunpowder is stored on site, and how much manufacturing is done, and so on. And we have apparently no power at this time to tell this business what to do on that. It's all regulated by someone else. But if they are willing to come in and have that discussion and set some limits and some clarifications to reassure the community as to what they're actually doing, then I think that we should explore that. So again, I don't see this as the same operating agreement that we've used in the past, and it strictly would be voluntary. And they might say no, but at least we've given it a try to put some containment.
Further discussion? Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Spector. I think, staff's recommendations up to this point have been sticking with the federal and state laws for oversight and what is in the jurisdiction of their licenses. I think as we move forward, we need to look at the example given to us about Lafayette and some of those rules and regulations. I think it's better for future potential firearms resellers that we all operate under the same laws, federal, state, and local, and for us to be receiving requests from Templar Sports and saying we will operate by these guidelines, and later on down the road no one remembers what those guidelines are. I think that's not the best approach moving forward. I think in all fairness we need to adopt universal rules moving forward. And if I might add a couple things that I'd like staff to look into. We had an issue with an employee when someone made a request for information to be added to a license, and I know we've discussed this, but I'd like it to be when we move forward with future requests for language that council gets to, how can I say it? We have, of course, a public hearing on that before that language is added to any license. I think it's important. I think that was the one piece of information that was really critical. Nobody understood how or why that arrived the way it did, and it caused a lot of concern that an applicant could just walk in, request valid for firearm sales, and have that added to their license so readily prior to council even knowing about it. So it's kind of a de facto approval by a staff level employee to sell guns in Los Gatos. And there would be nothing preventing, again, 6 more applicants by the end of the week marching in at this moment and asking for that language be added to their license. So I think moving forward we have to really consider what that means. It exists for a reason in federal law and state law, and I want that to be part of the discussion moving forward. Who authorizes that and under what circumstances? And I think it should come from a council majority moving forward.
I'm going to break this down. The operating agreement issue was raised by Mr. Brzezinski. Ms. McNutt is comfortable with it. We have 3 council people who had challenges. Ms. McNutt, you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, based on the Vice Mayor's comment, that it will never be universal because you can't retroactively apply a new law to an existing business. So Templar is always going to operate under a different set of operating agreements than what we have going forward. So, I'm not going to argue this endlessly, but again, it seemed like our only opportunity to put some controls and containment around them would be an operating agreement. But if we don't like that in principle, that's fine. But they're just can continue to do what they do, and the new businesses under the new rules will have a different set of playing guidelines.
Let me ask a question of staff. If we considered an operating agreement, would this delay the March 4th, or could it be done all at the same time?
I was assuming, given the council's comments of reluctantly going to March 4th, but wanting to have a date certain and adequate public notice, that that's top priority. So any voluntary operating agreement would be in second position to bringing the moratoria back for your consideration on March 4th. So it wouldn't delay it. That's what I'm saying in a long-winded way.
All right, with that in mind, I would be amenable to looking at an operating agreement for the reasons specified by Ms. McNutt, and as long as it doesn't delay the March 4th. Further discussion? Mr. Vice Mayor.
In the case of Templar Sports, our own police department reviews and checks and makes sure they're in compliance with all the laws, the federal and the state. And not that I don't trust our own police department, but I think moving forward, we should consider when there is a perceived conflict of interest by the public, that be handled by another agency. In the case of Templar Sports, this is unique. I realize I'm not certain if there will be any future gun stores open with our police department officers being the principals, but I think we should definitely consider moving forward that is handled by an outside agency to alleviate the public's concerns about a perceived conflict of interest in our police department.
Further discussion? All right. With regard to the operating agreement, Mr. Brzezinski, I'm going to keep bringing us back to this. What I understood is, at least what from somebody said, is that this would be an operating agreement that would come back to the council, and this would not be a staff-generated or staff-monitored operating agreement?
I was hearing it would be not a staff-approved. Anything that comes back would require council approval. So the language you used, I'm not sure what the difference was.
Staff-generated, staff-monitored.
I'm assuming staff would work with Templar to come up with the terms of the voluntary agreement, would recommend that to council, and council would have the decision-making power whether to adopt or reject that voluntary agreement. Any voluntary agreement would probably have some monitoring requirements. So the generating and monitoring, I'm trying to think, staff seems to have a role in generating the agreement for your consideration, and then based on what you approve in the agreement, monitoring and following up on it. So
yeah, and monitoring may be the incorrect term. Maybe council would be the determining factor as to whether or not there was a violation of the operating agreement.
Understood. Okay, that gives
That's
us
okay.
clear direction.
All right.
If
Well,
that's,
we're not
okay.
there yet.
Yeah.
So we have two people. Mr. Brzezinski, are you still in on the operating agreement?
Yes, Madam Mayor, I'm still in.
So we have two. Ms. Jensen.
My position hasn't changed, and particularly given Mr. Larson's comments just now, the history of this project illustrates that we need to have the public participate in all of it. So if we have a staff-generated operating agreement and a staff monitoring that same operating agreement, I think we run into the same historical problems that have brought so many people here today. So I would not support that.
Mr. Vice Mayor.
I'd like to echo those comments as well. I feel like we had I guess, go with this particular shop, our response has been there is no law that exists, therefore it's allowed. And I say moving forward, we stick with that with this particular approach. I think if you try to limit what they're doing, if their federal license says that they can sell gunpowder, unfortunately, that's what we allow them to do. But I don't think we can enforce if they volunteer and say, well, we're not going to sell gunpowder. I'm not sure if that would be something that we can actually do based on our own arguments moving forward. So I'm just not sure about it. Not sure what our limitations are with it.
All right, and I'm going to make the assumption that without an operating agreement, the town doesn't have much say in Templar as it stands right now, that any operating agreement would come back before the council. That would be a public forum. That any violation would come back before the council. That would be a public forum. Mr. Larson, am I getting anything incorrect there?
That is what I was understanding from the discussion. Absolutely. When we discussed a voluntary operating agreement in the staff addenda, we thought it might be a way to work with the, what we can now call incumbent firearms retailer to implement some of the same safety, security, and liability standards, excuse me, that we would hope to implement through a police permitting process that was described in the staff report. The other opportunity, as Templar representatives did mention at last week's meeting, that it's not their intention to pursue a Class 10 federal firearms license. So we thought there might be an opportunity to specify that in an operating agreement. This is all voluntary. They may or may not agree, and we'll see what we're able to bring back to you for consideration, if that's the council's will.
Further discussion. Mr. Vice Mayor.
It raises an interesting point. I mean, again, it comes down to what can we actually enforce. I mean, to me, our argument has been that we have no jurisdiction, and you know, can they voluntarily say we're not going to come back for a Class 10 license at this point? And we can hold them to that under federal law, under state law.
That's what we would explore based on your direction.
Okay. If it's generally exploratory, I'm definitely for it. I'm just concerned about our ability to enforce things going forward, and then having another, well, I'll just leave the comment at that. Loss of thought, sorry.
All right, Mr. Larson, I hear a direction from a majority of the council, might be a soft direction, for an operating agreement draft, but not to delay March 4th.
And to clarify, the operating agreement, it was mentioned, would be with the police department. That is not correct. The operating agreement, if the council considers it and approves it, would be between the town and Templar. And I just wanted to correct that on the record.
All right, so at this point, this item is completed. And so I know that we have verbal communications yet left on our agenda. But what I'll do is I'll take about a 5-minute break. So those of you who don't want to stick around for verbal communications can exit, and then we'll do our verbal communications before I call the meeting to an end.
Madam Mayor, I'm sorry.
Ms. Jensen?
When did you want me to, or did you want me to put any proposed findings for the moratorium on the record? After the break, before verbal communications, or just simply submit them to Ms. Prop?
I can't do that.
Okay.
After the break.
Okay. Thank you.
I want to call this meeting back to order. This was a long 5 minutes. All the council members have returned. Staff has returned. If everybody who has remained in the audience would please take a seat. Ms. Jensen, the floor is yours for now.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I was just going to suggest to the town staff just some findings that were based on both tonight and our last meeting in support of a interim ordinance. So as I understand what's required for the ordinance, we would need to adopt it in, for example, that we're contemplating zoning changes, which we obviously are based upon our motion tonight, and that the change that we are contemplating is in conflict with, would be in conflict with our town code, and it seems to me that that is also true, given that we don't have a town code right now. And we also need to make this, the ordinance needs to find that there's a public health, safety, welfare indication for this to happen. And we heard, among other things, at our last meeting that, and we've seen in media reports in the town, that there have been complaints about vandalism, graffiti, rude conduct, litter, etc. in front of the shop. We have heard comments about threats made in conjunction with the shop. We've heard comments about the proximity to a school and a park and an avenue used by students. And just in looking at other ordinances adopted in other communities, those have all been, seems to me, used successfully in supporting this kind of ordinance. We've also had 3 protests, peaceful, but protests in front of the store. And obviously there are complex issues of state, federal, and local law that are all implicated in connection with whatever we do here. And all of those things seem to indicate that they would support the town in adopting an emergency ordinance. So I'm just suggesting those as possible things for staff to look at.
Thank you. Any questions from staff?
Thank you.
All right, well, let me, one issue came up for me over the break, and it relates to the Lafayette ordinance that was sent to us. And as I understand the Lafayette ordinance, and staff said that they have it or they're going to be looking at it, that gave existing uses X amount of time, I think it was 60 days, to comply with the new ordinance. And is this something that staff can examine when it's examining the Lafayette ordinance?
We can certainly examine it. I have not reviewed the Lafayette ordinance yet. I did review Campbell's, which was the police permitting solution, which they did apply to existing firearms retailers. That wasn't a land use process. That was a firearms permitting process. And the existing retailers had a period of time to come into compliance. I'll defer to the attorney if Lafayette is dealing with both permitting and land use.
Well, we do have a copy of the Lafayette ordinance along with Palo Alto, Sacramento, Los Angeles, as the manager said, Campbell, and a number of others. Some of the ordinances contain what is, I believe the mayor is referring to as an amortization for a existing use. The town already has certain codes that staff has looked at that govern amortization in this particular retail use. And so when we bring back our recommendations for any new land use measures, we'll certainly discuss whether or not, given the existing town codes, that the town could adopt any amortization provisions with respect to any new ordinances going forward.
Thank you. All right, anything further? Seeing none on this issue, so we'll call this issue to a close and go to verbal communications. This is the opportunity for anyone in the audience who wishes to address us for 3 minutes on anything that was not on our agenda. You can come forward at this point. I note that no one is rushing forward. Accordingly, this meeting's adjourned.